Hi, I'm Phil Candreva at the Naval Postgraduate School. This short video is an introduction to the Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution System, PPBE, used within the Department of Defense to create the annual defense budget and to manage it. Because I have a Navy background and teach at a Naval University, although this is a DoD-wide system, I'm going to explain it primarily using Navy examples. Now, PPBE is one of several main processes within the DoD. And you sometimes hear the term Big A acquisition, which refers to all three of these processes. The JSID system for defining requirements, the PPBE system for resourcing those requirements, and the acquisition system for buying those things. So just to explain them very quickly and maybe in a little silly way, let's imagine that your daughter comes up to you one day and says, Daddy, will you buy me a new bicycle? If you ran your household like the Department of Defense, you would say, well, honey, do you have a requirement for a bicycle? Can you justify why you need that bicycle? And she would say something like, well, I've grown 6 inches since I got my last bicycle, Daddy, and my knees hit the handlebars when I ride, and that's dangerous. And you told me when I turned 9 years old that I could ride my bike to school. And I'm now 9, and I need a reliable bike that's safe. And then you might say, oh, okay, so I validate that. You have a requirement for a bicycle. Great, let's go buy it, Daddy. Well, no. All we've done is establish you have a requirement for a bicycle. We don't know if we have the resources to buy the bicycle. In our house, Mommy manages the books, so let's go talk to Mom. So your daughter goes up to Mom and says, Mom, will you buy me a new bicycle? And she says, whoa. Do you have a requirement for a bicycle? Yes, Mommy. Daddy validated my requirement for a bicycle. Oh, okay, good. Well, let me look at the family budget. And she looks at the budget and says, yes, we have enough money for a bicycle. Great, let's go out and buy it. Well, not so fast, honey. In our family, we have a process for buying things. All we know now is you have a requirement for a bicycle, and we know we can afford it. But we have an acquisition system, and Uncle Mike is the expert in bicycles. He knows the difference between a mountain bike and a beachcomber and a road bike and, 1 speed, 18 speed, 12 speed, whatever. He knows all that stuff. And he'll be here on the weekend, and he knows all the right places to buy bicycles. So this weekend, you bring your requirement to Uncle Mike, I'll provide him the money, and then you can go out and buy the bicycle. So we have these three main processes within the Department of Defense. PPBE, the subject of this video, is about resourcing those requirements. And then the E part, the execution, is then going out and buying the things that help us create a military. So PPBE ultimately, provides a budget that we're going to hand to Congress and ask for resources. So what is a budget? It's a document that expresses in financial terms a plan for accomplishing an organization's objectives during a period of time. So it's time-phased, it's a plan, it's a document. You can download this thing, all 20,000 pages of it, and but it does outline what we hope to do, what we want to do in the following fiscal year. So it's an instrument of planning, but also performance management, decision-making, management control, the statement of priorities. It's an expression to the Congress and the people of this country of what the military wants and believes is the right thing to have in the following fiscal year. But it's more than just a plan. It's analogous to a contract. If we go to Congress and say, may I please have $2 billion for a submarine? And they say, yes, that seems like a good deal. And we come back 2 years later and say, sorry, we really need $2.5 billion for that submarine. Congress gets upset, just as you would if a contractor said it would be $25,000 to renovate your kitchen, and then says, no, it's really going to be 30. Right? Budgets tend to be aspirational. We tend to be optimistic when we build budgets, and so there's risk there. Budgets mobilize stakeholders, whether they are contractors or veterans groups or interest groups or others who may benefit or who may be harmed by the proposals in that budget, will come forward to lobby the government We use the budget to influence the economy, to create jobs, to spread jobs around various areas. Um, and it's really a request, it's not a forecast. It's what we want to have, it's not necessarily what we believe we're going to get. And Congress has the final say, according to the Constitution. They have the power of the purse. And so we will typically not get exactly what we ask for, and we're probably going to get it late. 80% of the time, the appropriations and authorizations are late. And so we should plan for that as well. A little bit of history of PPBE. It's a system that was designed in the early 60s during the Kennedy administration. President Kennedy wanted the Secretary of Defense, Mr. McNamara at the time, to exercise more control over the individual services. And because we were only a decade since the creation of a Department of Defense from the Departments of War and Navy. And so he brought in experts in systems analysis, which is a system process of breaking things down into their component parts and looking at how they integrate together. And his comptroller, Charlie Hitch, had written a book called The Economics of Defense, and bringing economic principles and systems analysis into the Pentagon to design this budgeting system. So that's a little bit of the history of PPBE. The fact that we've been using it for 60 years means it's either very robust or long overdue for reform, I guess. The essence of PPBE is to take the National Defense Strategy, which has embedded in it and which drives operational plans. How would we go to war if we needed to go to war? Those plans require certain military capabilities. In order to have those capabilities, we need to man, train, and equip the services. In order to man, train, and equip the services, we need to allocate resources to people and activities and things, ships and planes and vehicles and weapon systems. In order to get those resources, we have to justify these decisions and plans to Congress. They provide those resources, and then we go ahead and execute the mission. So that's the essence of it. That's what the system is designed to do. Let's now dive into the 4 pieces of PPBE. There's a strategy phase first, right? The President, the National Security Council, looks at the global situation, looks at the political environment, assesses our adversaries and allies' capabilities and desires, analyzes threats, thinks about war plans and functional capabilities, and we're going to then identify differences between what we would like to be able to do and what we currently can do and have already programmed to do in the last budget. Then each of the military departments, given that strategy and those priorities, will define a mix of programs. And programs could be tangible assets, like a Joint Strike Fighter or an H-60 helicopter. They're human skills, like bosun's mates and medical officers. And their activities, training, maintenance, recruiting, education. And we're going to do that over a medium-term time horizon, a 5-year plan. And what we're trying to do in allocating these resources is minimize those differences that were identified in the strategy phase. After that, the major commands throughout the Navy, and when I say a major command, think Echelon 2, something like NAVAIR, NAVSEA, Fleet Forces Command, Bureau of Personnel, those kinds of organizations will craft budgets to justify the decisions made in that programming phase, to write up the documentation that forms the budget that goes over to Congress. The next step is to support Congress as they enact the budget. They'll hold hearings, they'll ask for information, they'll come visit commands. And so we want to help them by supplying the information they need to make their decisions. And then once Congress appropriates the money and authorizes the programs, we then execute. We obligate the funds, and we will review how things are going and feed that into the next round. So PPBE is about strategy, guiding a program, a set of programs that we justify in a budget request, and then execute once we have the funding. So there's a planning phase, which is that strategizing piece, right? Identifying these gaps and overmatches between strategy and capabilities and creating the priorities for the programming phase. The key output of the planning phase is at the OSD level, the defense planning guidance, at the Navy level, the CNO's guidance for creating the next POM, which is the output from the programming phase. Programming phase is that resource allocation phase, where we allocate resources to these people, activities, things over that 5-year period. We then craft a budget to justify those decisions and put it in a format that feeds the political process of appropriations and authorizations. The output from budgeting would be the budget estimate submission, which is, think of it as the rough draft. We do a budget at the service level, we do a budget at the OSD level, and then we do the final president's budget, which is what goes to Congress. And finally, the execution phase is implementing the laws that are written, implementing that authorization bill, implementing that appropriation bill to create those desired capabilities. Right? And the output is a Navy, an Army, an Air Force. Let's look at the calendar. This is a process that takes about 2 years from beginning to end to build this budget, get it enacted, even before we begin executing it. So let's assume it's early March of calendar year 2021. In calendar year 2021, we would be executing fiscal year 21's money. Fiscal year 21 would have begun on October 1st of 2020. So we'd be spending our FY21 funding. We'd also be in the second year of executing our FY20 money. Some appropriations last more than a year. The budget is due to Congress the first Monday in February of each year. So Congress would have recently received the fiscal year 22 budget, and they would be holding hearings, trying to understand it, trying to see what DoD proposed, marking it up, and making their decisions. So we would be enacting the FY22 budget. Meanwhile, we would be programming the FY23 budget, and we'd be in the very early stages of planning the FY24 budget. So on any given day, there are multiple budgets, multiple fiscal years in play at a time. So the planning phase, we're going to now go into each of the 4 phases in a little bit more detail. The planning phase is about strategic planning, writing a national security strategy, a national defense strategy, a maritime strategy, assessing where we are with respect to our military capabilities, assessing our intelligence on threats, analyzing the results of wargaming, and we would be then identifying these gaps or potentially overmatches between our requirements and our capabilities. And then we need to look at some baseline data. What's the likely budget? What are we hearing from the Office of Management and Budget in the White House about how much money we'll have in the future? What's the status of current execution of today's budget? And we would set those priorities for the programming phase, issue that defense planning guidance, issue the CNO's guidance for programming. The programming phase is looking at alternatives. So the defense guidance, the CNO's guidance, might say we need certain capabilities, but maybe there's multiple ways to achieve that capability. Maybe what we need to do is to be able to take out a target under certain circumstances. Well, we might be able to do that from the air, we might be able to do it from a ship, we might be able to insert personnel to do it. So we think about those different alternatives and analyze them and try and decide which is most effective, maybe most cost effective. We'll also look at individual program wholeness. How much money does the Columbia submarine program need in order to design and build that submarine? How much money does the Joint Strike Fighter need to build more Joint Strike Fighters or to maintain them or to operate them? How much money does the Naval Academy need in order to graduate its next class? So we look at these programs at an individual level. Then we look at cross-program integration. So we are operating ships at sea. We're also maintaining ships, maybe at the organizational level, maybe in a shipyard. We're building ships, we're decommissioning ships, we're training sailors to be on ships. And those ships have weapon systems, and some ships are air capable, so we've got an aircraft. And so we're going to look at the integration of all of those different programs to make sure that they're in balance. And then every budget has to think about, which do we prioritize? Do we prioritize current readiness, or do we prioritize investing in future readiness by buying more capability? And that's a balancing act that we have to think about every year. We also have to think about capability versus capacity. Do we want really, really good systems, or do we want a lot of less good systems? So numbers, quantity is a quality of its own, right? We need a certain number of ships, but we also want them to be very capable ships. And so there's a trade-off because we're resource constrained. And we're always going to be looking at reforms for efficiency to save some money. And we do this in a rolling 5-year plan. So if we think about this idea of systems analysis and breaking the military into its component pieces, we have these various major force programs, which were part of the original design of PPBE. Strategic forces being the nuclear triad, general purpose forces being kind of your plain vanilla Navy ship, Air Force fighter, Army infantry unit, and then you can see the other categories. So we need to fund these things and balance among these various categories. We have to balance among various appropriations. So in strategic forces, are we maintaining that submarine? Are we designing a new submarine? Are we buying the submarine? Or are we training the people to be on the submarine? So we've got to think about all those pieces. And then we've got the various components. Of course, the submarine would be part of the Navy, but a particular aircraft in H-60, we've got them in the Navy, we've got them in the Air Force, we've got them in the Army. So which service is getting the resources and is going to manage this? And we're not only trading off between these categories of spending, appropriations and components, we're doing that over a rolling 5-year period, and we may be moving resources forward and back in time if we can't afford to do everything that we want to do now. And being able to afford things is an issue. Each POM process, right, begins with the last one. So we have a 5-year plan. We have an existing plan. So it's really about reallocation, not about an original allocation. And total requirements always exceed total resources. We can always be more ready. We can always be more capable. We can always have, we need to have an advantage over our adversaries at all times. And so there's no shortage of requirements, but there is a shortage of resources. And so when resources for a given program are insufficient, what can the programmer do to fix that? And we call these the 4 R's. The first thing they can do is resource that program by taking money away from a lower priority program. That's why having a good strategy and a good set of priorities and good guidance up front is important, to know what's most important and should be funded, what's less important and could give up some resources. The other thing we could do is restructure the program. So maybe the requirement is to buy 20 of these things in the next 4 years by buying 5 a year. But if we don't have enough money, maybe we buy 20 of them over 5 years by buying only 4 a year. That gets us the capability a little slower, but it still gets us the capability. Or we just buy fewer of them. Maybe we don't have enough money to buy 20, but we have enough money to buy 18. And so we buy 18 instead of 20. We could try re-engineering the program. Is there a way to buy 20 of these things that are a little bit less capable? Maybe they're a little less durable. Maybe they carry a slightly smaller amount of weapons. Maybe they don't fly as far without refueling. So we look at where might there be reasonable trade-offs in cost and capability. The last thing we can do is just give that program a little bit less money and simply accept that risk. Yeah, I heard you. You told me you need $5 million a year to do this. I'm going to give you 4.8. Good luck. So Now we move to the budgeting phase from programming. We've made these resource allocation decisions. When we program, the focus is on major programs. We tend to put most of our attention on the big ticket items, right? The things that cost a lot of money. When we budget, we have to budget for every penny, right? So every single program needs to be involved in budgeting. The responsibility for programming is typically done at the service headquarters. In the Navy, that would be the op-nav staff, and 8 sort of runs the process, and 9 has a lot of the money for hardware, and 1 has money for people, and 4 deals with readiness and installations and those kinds of things. In the Marine Corps, it's headquarters, Marine Corps P&R, Programs and Resources, that does this. Budgeting moves down a layer in the chain of command. Budgeting is done out at what we call budget submitting offices, and they're mostly Echelon 2 commands. Think Fleet Forces Command, PAC Fleet, the Systems Commands, Nav Air, Nav Sea, Navy Warfare Command, and think of the support organizations like the Bureau of Personnel, BUMED, will do the budgeting because they have the detailed information to put that budget together. We tend to program in gross amounts, approximate estimates. Budgeting needs to be precise. We need to think about, using the right inflation factor, that kind of thing. The output of programming is the POM, the Program Objectives Memorandum. The output of budgeting is the budget estimate submission at the Navy and OSD level, or the President's budget at the congressional level. And we think of programming, we organize that by mission area. How much do we need, and what's the right mix of things to do undersea warfare? But when we budget, we then break that up by appropriation. How much do we need in procurement? How much do we need in O&M? How much do we need in R&D? So the budget is a justification to Congress and through Congress to the American public for funds for these people, things, and activities that we wish to carry out. And so it's both a plan and a request. And when it's done well, the budget is accurately priced and feasibly scheduled. That if the minimum production quantity on a production line is 20 and the maximum is 40, feasibly scheduled means we're ordering between 20 and 40 of this item, right? That the production line can actually produce it, and that we have considered all of the costs and the cost drivers and come up with a reasonable price. We have to make sure we're using the right appropriation. It's got to be executable. That means we can actually do it. The technology is mature. The production line is able to do it. The raw materials are available. We have enough human beings to get the work done. And the budget needs to be consistent. So if we claim we're going to fly more hours, we should probably be asking for more fuel, right? So that's consistent internal to that budget. It should be consistent over time. If last year we said we're going to finish the project next year, then next year's budget should address whether or not that project's really going to be finished or not, right? And the budget needs to be consistent with other budgets that are affected. So if we have a separate budget for advanced procurement money versus the regular procurement money, that those two should line up, right? Those numbers ought to be the same. And as I've already mentioned, we do 3 budgets a year. We do a Navy budget in the summertime, an OSD budget in the fall, and the President's budget is done in January, so you can go over to Congress in February. And each cycle adds new information and becomes more and more precise, if you will, as it works its way up the chain. In the middle of PPBE, Congress is involved, right? PPBE pretty much describes what we do within the DoD, but there's a pause in the system, right? We send this budget over to Congress in February before we can execute it. And so they have their turn kind of in the middle of this system. The congressional process is a 3-part process with a budget resolution, an authorization, and an appropriation. I'm not going to get into that now. There's a separate video online that introduces that process to you. But just be aware that Congress has its own process for getting this budget done. Fiscal year begins on 1 October, and if there's not an appropriation by then, we either have a government shutdown or more likely Congress passes a continuing resolution, which is a stopgap, a temporary appropriation. Now, appropriations don't actually provide money. They provide the authority to oblige the government. They give you legal permission to enter into contracts, to hire people, to requisition things that eventually lead to some money going out of the Treasury. So what's this permission like? This permission is like taking your kid to the county fair. And you're thinking, what the heck are you talking about? So you go to the county fair with your son, and he says, hey, Mom, I'd like to go play arcade games. You know, where you throw the baseball at the milk bottles and try and knock them down and you win a stuffed animal. And you say, okay, son, yeah, you can go play arcade games, but you can only spend $10. You can't spend more than $10. You can only play arcade games. You can't use that money to buy a hot dog or a soda. And meet me at the Ferris wheel in 30 minutes. Okay? That's what an appropriation is like. You gave him a certain amount of money, $10. You restricted what he could spend that on, arcade games only, no food, and you gave him a time limit, 30 minutes. And if your son is late, you're going to be angry. If he spends more than $10, you'll be angry. And if he shows up looking like this because he was eating funnel cakes instead of playing arcade games, you're going to be angry. And similarly, we have fiscal laws that say you have to use money for the purpose for which it was provided, in the time period that was allowed, and only in the amount that was provided. Time periods for expense type appropriations, O&M and mill-pers, is a year. For investment type appropriations, R&D, procurement, construction, we have 2 to 5 years in order to sign those contracts, do that work. After that, the funds expire, which means we cannot enter into any new obligations, but we still have 5 years to sort of pay the bills or make adjustments to existing obligations. So if we wrote a contract in the middle of the year, those things are delivered after the fiscal year ends or the appropriation expires, we can still pay that bill or adjust it if the total bill came into a number different than what we had estimated. At the end of that 5-year period, the appropriation closes, and that's like closing a bank account. We can't write checks on that appropriation anymore at the end of that 5-year period. And as we execute, we have to balance two things, right? We have these laws we have to follow, and we have a mission to support. We got work to do, but we have to follow the rules with using the money. And sometimes these two can be a little bit at odds with one another. So this is the PPBE system: planning, programming, budgeting, and execution. If it's done properly, it integrates well with and supports other key processes within the Department of Defense. The policies we set, the requirements we generate, the operational plans that we have, and the acquisition system to buy the capabilities that we need. So that's PPBE.